Hey guys, welcome back to more tutorials. That doesn't really make sense, but it doesn't matter because today we're talking about defeating swarm hosts in PvZ. And I know a lot of people have been waiting for this one, and we're going to be talking a lot about what makes Zerg vulnerable when they run swarm hosts, the type of composition and what you need to do with your army to defeat swarm hosts. And we're going to talk about a couple of other options that are available to deal with swarm hosts that aren't typically seen a lot in pro games, mostly because they just get phased in and out of the meta so fast in Korea that you don't tend to see it surface very often, but it's still there. So let's go ahead and jump into the game, and we're going to be taking a look at Whelmu versus Starbuck. And mostly we're going to address a couple things. Number one is that swarm hosts are typically not a thing until somebody gets up into 3 bases on Zerg. You'll occasionally see stuff like 2-base swarm hosts, but in that case, it's kind of more considered like a cheese that shouldn't really work. I've had good experience in the past with using Tempest to push off 2-base swarm hosts, but you could always go for a Colossus instead. I'm not really going to talk about that because you never ever see that at high levels, so theoretically you really should never see it in your own games, but if it becomes a big enough problem and people request it a lot, then I can put stuff like that in there. I'll have a hard time getting replays for it. But anyway, we're not going to focus too much on the openers, so we're just going to run in. I mean, we've talked about openers many times before, so we should already know what's going on by this point. We're going to mostly get to the point where Zerg start doing swarm host plays. And the only way it makes sense for Zerg to do a swarm host play is if you take a 3rd base, because any 2-base all-in or anything like that should kill before swarm hosts are out on the map. So most of the time Zergs will just go for a 3-base swarm host type of strategy rather than 2. So, we'll fast forward up until that point. You can see Whelmu is just expanding right now. Of course, he's going to get his own 3rd base, the Zerg is as soon as possible. So the Zerg's just kind of waiting until the Protoss takes a 3rd. But you can take a 3rd and still launch pretty fast attacks against swarm hosts. And that's going to be the first point that we're going to talk about here, that Whelmu does. We've talked a lot about Blink in the past against Zerg, and this is kind of a review of that. This is going to be one of the better ways to deal with these swarm host builds, because if you get up on top of them before the swarm host can really do that much, then all of a sudden they don't mean that much. So this is one good way to deal with it. You can see the Blink is on the way in +2, so if you need more information on how to use Blink in this matchup, I just posted a video for it maybe a week ago, so you can go back and check that out. Also, the Robo being on the way is like we talk about, it's usually for Colossus transitions. This case, you're going to want to start out with an Observer, just because you need to be able to detect the swarm hosts. And you can see on the Zerg side, infestation pits coming down, so swarm hosts are definitely on the way. Now this is why you want to move out with these little timings with Blink, is to put some pressure on there, and you can see Starbuck trying to buy some time, but it's not really working. So once Whelmu gets Blink finished up and +2 finished up, you can start getting aggressive and out on the map. This doesn't need to be any sort of commitment right now, but you can see the swarm host coming out, and he's going to start sieging with these swarm hosts, and this is where you need to start to get creative. More importantly, the swarm hosts need to pay for themselves. They need to kill something for it to be worth it for the Zerg. And Blink and Force Field is one of the ways that you can assure that the Locusts don't really do much. So what he's doing, he's just marching right up into the base here. There's not enough swarm hosts to put out enough Locusts to really defend against this right away. There's only 4, and those Locusts are really easy pickings. I mean, you could easily just Force Field these off and blink away if you start to take damage from them. So this base is going to die, and these types of faster pressures are things that are really good against swarm host builds. This isn't an all-in or anything. I mean, he's still making probes behind this. You can see he has his other base all still probed up. And if you can get on top of the swarm host with an Observer, then obviously you can kill the swarm hosts and then they don't matter. So in the meantime, if you can't, just Force Field off. Maybe you can use Time Warps to slow things down, and you can continue to Blink if you start taking some damage on these Stalkers. Like we talked about with Blink before, the point of this is also just to get into Colossus, and ultimately you're going to want Colossus to kill the Locusts once they start to get bigger and bigger. So you can see the Blink attack is still going. The Locusts have really done nothing so far because they haven't really had a good opportunity to, considering Force Fields and Blink have really kind of nullified them so far. So again, this is one really good way to get ahead against these swarm host builds. And you can see him starting to fall back. He's getting pushed back here just a little bit, but he dealt quite a bit of damage. See the worker count, he killed 22, and overall he's ahead in workers by a lot right now. So he's kind of dealt the damage that he needs to. He can't just throw this game away now though, and he still needs to be careful, but there's still a lot of maneuvering and stuff that he can do with these Blink Stalkers. So I'm just going to come back up here, seeing a couple of locusts. You can see there's still some more swarm hosts being added on right now. And part of the reason this is working out as well is because Starbuck has had to make other units that are not swarm hosts in order to hold this off. So good, fast, crisp timings are always really good ways to deal with big tech-heavy Zerg plays. He's still just coming in here, really not losing anything against the locusts. He can get into positions. Again, he just blinks away from the locust. He can focus down this base. If he needs to, he can force field off just to get rid of the locust for a second. And this can sometimes just get out of control like this. This is really a good play here from Wellmute, just to press his advantage and not to let up and not to just go home and be scared against the swarm host. Really just getting on top of him, and you can see he's catching some stuff over here right now as far as being on top of it. So I'm kind of just glazing over this replay a little bit because we can all tell what's going on. We can tell that he's starting to get swarm hosts with his Blink Stalker play, and he's getting it mostly based upon aggression. But I know that this isn't the phase of the game that most people have trouble with. Obviously, if you want to run this type of build, this is really standard in this matchup for a reason, because it punishes a lot of really fast tech plays. I think most people have trouble with the later stages of the game. We can see that this game ends in just a few minutes, and just looking at the game status, it's 73 workers to 37, so there's no way Starbuck is ever going to recover from this. So let's just jump into stuff that people might be a little bit more interested in, and that is a longer-term swarm host game. Need to wait for this to load before I click on the replay. Last time I did that, it just like loaded an empty screen. It was weird. So this time we're going to see Zest versus Sulky. Sulky is one of the most well-known Zergs for running swarm host and late-game Zerg type of styles against Protoss. So this is a really good game, especially to learn from. Both these players were really on top of their game at the time of this replay, and they are right now too. I mean, these two are super strong. So obviously we want to look at the Protoss player. And again, Zergs really typically won't get aggressive with swarm hosts until 3 bases. So we're going to kind of fast forward up until Zest has taken that 3rd base. We're going to note his build order along the way, so it's just Nexus first. He's going into Gateway, which is ridiculously greedy. I wouldn't recommend this too much, but that's because I guess he knows Sulky well enough to know that he likes to triple hatch before pool on this map, so not going to pay too much attention to that. Stargate on the way here from Zest, and this is going to be really normal for things like Phoenix. Maybe he can open with an Oracle and take a 3rd base that way, but the point being is just that we're going to keep going until he takes a 3rd. And there's the Phoenix right now. And on Sulky's side, we can see on the production tab, nothing too special. There are some Zerglings coming out to maybe try and cancel a 3rd base. And also, this is more meta stuff, not really enough to pay attention to, but Zest does like to go for some Phoenix and Zealot timing, so that might be what that's for as well. But nothing too crazy going on. I know it feels like we're glossing over a lot of this and making it sound oversimplified, so we're going to start talking about it a lot more once the swarm hosts start to surface in this game. So you can see this is just the basic Phoenix into Colossus type of play. You take a 3rd base and you protect yourself with Colossus. And Colossus ultimately are the best way to deal with Locusts in the late game. So you need to find a way to deal with Locusts or make them not matter. And that's basically the hardest thing to do against swarm hosts. It's the fact that the Locusts are free and they're just relentless. They come at you all the time. So you can deal with this in 1 of 2 ways, and we'll start talking about that as this game starts to shape up. You can see the infestation pit on the way for the swarm host in just a second. But you can deal with this by just trying to completely overpower the Locust by having too many Colossus. Maybe you have force fields to make it so that the Locusts don't do anything. Or you can try to counter-harass and punish him for his Locust not being in the right spot. You can do that with Blink, you can do that with Warp Prisms, you can do that maybe with Void Ray flybys if you want to do stuff like that. But the composition for Zest is going to be Void Ray Colossus, just 1 Void Ray at a time. You can go more Void Rays than that if you want to, just to keep your Colossus alive. And the other concern with these swarm hosts is, yes, they're going to be out on the map and sending Locusts at you, and you have to deal with that. But the next stage for the Zerg is to try to kill your counter to the swarm hosts, which is the Colossus. So they're going to go for something like Corruptors a lot of the time to deal with those. And that's why Zest is already preempting this and going with the Void Rays to answer the Corruptors. So it starts to be like a stacking game where let's say they throw out the swarm host first, and you say, oh yeah, Colossus, and they say, oh yeah, Corruptors, and you say, oh yeah, Void Rays, and then they say, oh yeah, an answer for Void Rays is X, Y, and Z, and you just keep going that way. And that's how a lot of these games can shape up. So we won't see huge games typically at the pro levels with tons and tons of swarm hosts, because the pros will have already stacked up the tech counters like that already. So in this game, we're just going to see a handful of swarm hosts just to be annoying enough and just to force Zest to produce a lot of Colossus before he gets too crazy with it. So we can see from the units right now, there's 12 swarm hosts out, and it's pretty rare at the pro levels for them to go up into like 20 or 30, because a lot of times they'll just die to things like counterattacks or a lot of Colossus or something like that. And speaking of counterattacks, as soon as Zest realizes that he's facing swarm hosts, he immediately produces a warp prism. And this is because the swarm hosts need to have their own support with them. Whether that's corruptors, in this case it's queens for a little while to protect against things like void rays. You can they'll mix in other things like roaches, zerglings and whatnot. But more importantly, if they're putting pressure on you with these locusts and sending them at your base, they need to keep those swarm hosts protected, which means that their bases will not be protected. So you really do need to get a warp prism out there, maybe 2. Zealot charge is also really good to make sure your zealots get in there as fast as possible. And he's also researching +1 air weapons, because in super late game you can start to mix in things like tempests and carriers to try to break those sieges a little bit easier. Like I said, this is one of those things that's not terribly common at the highest levels in Korea, because they come in and come out so fast and the game changes so fast that sometimes they just don't surface in pro tournaments. But they will still be a thing during practice sessions. So we can see Sulky starting to respond to the Colossus with a Spire. This should be for corruptors. And Zest's Warp Prism, we need to definitely keep an eye on that. Notice that whenever he's engaging the Locusts, the Colossus are obviously what's doing the work, but you mostly need to micro away from the Locusts and not take any damage if you can help it. So we're going to be watching this just a little bit. So he's going to be, whenever there aren't Locusts there, he's going to push out a little bit further and try to gain some position on the map. There are some Zealots over here just kind of fighting a little bit. But then when the Locusts start to rally up, he's going to fight, micro back, and keep doing that over and over, so he's not really taking any damage. And the range on the Colossus and the splash on the Colossus is going to be what deals with the Locusts okay. So it's not like he's wasting units having to deal with this. He's trying to deal with this as efficiently as possible, and it really just takes his own APM and his own control to be able to do that. Note at the same time, here's that Warp Prism, warping in some Zealots to try and cancel this base. This will force a lot of different things. Now this, you should think about this in multiple ways. Number one, yes, this could kill bases. This could kill tech if you warp it into the main base. It could do all that great stuff, but oftentimes what it'll do is it'll abandon the swarm hosts or make them move in one way or another. So let's say the composition here is something like swarm host and Hydra or Viper or something like that. If you start to get attacked at other points of the map, maybe they pull their support away from the swarm hosts and leave them exposed. So you should be looking out for different ways to maybe get around these locusts and punish them for not moving their swarm hosts away if they have to respond to this type of harassment. So if you start harassing, let's say they report back there with something, maybe they rally their swarm hosts there, then you can just walk around the locusts and maybe burn up a bunch of swarm hosts with your Void Rays or with your Colossus or something. Or if they're rallied on a straight line like this, you can always just walk around and avoid the locusts and maybe get on top of the swarm hosts that way. You need to be constantly seeking out ways to avoid taking locust fire and try to get on top of unprotected swarm hosts, and this counter-harassment is one of the best ways to do that. So the Zealots are, I mean, they should deal an okay amount of damage. They probably won't cancel this base, but Sulky's smart enough to know that he might get counterattacked right then, so he needs to keep his swarm hosts unburrowed for just a little while. And meanwhile, Zest's still just trying to economically deal with the swarm host locusts that come out. More Zealots being warped in here, and you should think about it this way as well. These Zealots are worthless against Locusts. They're going to do nothing but die. So you might as well put the Zealots in a position that they're actually going to accomplish something. And that's the whole point of warping in tons of these Zealots and being willing to just throw them away. Because they're going to die to the Locust anyway. You might as well spend them, you might as well let them die in an efficient manner. If that makes sense. So more Colossus still rallying down here right now. More Void Rays on the way. You can see Blink is on the way as well. A Templar Archives is on the way, and that's a little advanced. That's more so to deal with Vipers. Templar are one of the worst units against Swarm Hosts, so I wouldn't get too attached to that idea. Here's the Corruptors now, and now that Zest sees that he has a little bit of an opportunity, he can see the composition right now, considering his Zealots have died to all this stuff. He knows the composition is basically Corruptor, Queen, some Roaches, and Swarm Hosts. So since he knows he has a decent counter, to most of those units, he can start being a little bit aggressive on the map. You don't want to just sit back in your base and let him rally Locusts at you endlessly. You want to make him move around and maybe make him make a mistake. So the Colossus is still trying to micro against these Locusts a little bit. You can see Sulky has to reposition these, and this is a smart Zerg player that has to constantly reposition because he knows he's going to be under threat if big attack moves out there and he's not in the right spot. Since the Warp Prism died, he probably should be producing another one, but he's just getting an Observer now, realizing that he needs some way to detect the Swarm Host if he gets on top of him. So just getting into that phase now. You'll also note that the upgrades are really good on the Colossus, and that's one of the most important things, to make sure that your Colossus can kill these Locusts as fast as possible, so keep up on your attack upgrades. It's kind of an unsaid law in PvZ. And now the Swarm Hosts are getting a little bit close here. He needs to start trying to find ways to deal with that. If you lose buildings here, you definitely need to be on top of rebuilding them, and this is going to start to get really annoying. But these Swarm Hosts are still fairly unprotected, and this is so close, and he has such a good composition to answer everything that Sulky has, that he could actually start trying to just push out and try to just straight up kill these Swarm Hosts or push them away. And Sulky's being really annoying with the multi-pronging here, but you can efficiently deal with those if you just work in. Now it's to the point where Zest realizes the type of power that he has in his composition, this Void Ray, Colossus, and Archon composition. If you can get on top of these Swarm Hosts, then they should die pretty effortlessly. So Zest is starting to realize that, and he's mitigated the damage well enough from the Locust so far to not take too much. He obviously couldn't do this well against a huge amount of Swarm Hosts, but then he wouldn't have nearly enough to protect against things like Warp Prism Harass. So this is all about just being patient, constantly moving your army around, and constantly trading well against the Locusts. Right now, I don't think the Swarm Hosts have killed much more than a Cybernetics Core, maybe a Pylon or two, maybe some Zealots, and that's about it. And that's about where you want to keep them. So more Zealot run-bys here. You can see that he can just rally these Zealots over to this side. And if he attracts a lot of these support units, then maybe he can walk in from the other side and burn down these Swarm Hosts. But you're not usually going to see that in pro games, because people that know how to use Swarm Hosts at high levels won't die to stuff like that. So, still just trying to effectively trade as well as possible against these things. You can see there are now Vipers on the way, so that's what the Templars were for. You can also see Zest adding more Stargates. So he's up to, I think, 4 Stargates now, unless he got one of them killed, which I actually think he did. Now he's ready. Now he's finally just like, I have enough Colossus. There's 5 Colossus here, all with +3. He has enough Void Rays here to help out against the Colossus. There's Archons to help with the splash. And he's willing to throw these Zealots away against the Locust, considering he needs some type of buffer if he's just going to run right in there. So this is the time where you need to realize, if you ever have a point where you can be aggressive and get on top of these Swarm Hosts, you got to go for it. And you can't just continually stand around. One other thing he needs to be careful of is not losing his Observer here. That can be a little bit sloppy. But if you do lose your Observer and you win the fight otherwise, and there's still Swarm Hosts stuck in the ground, just stand your army right on top of it, because the Colossus splash and the Archon splash and stuff will still deal damage to these Swarm Hosts. And then just rally an Observer to your army, so that if he unburrows, then he's dead. That's one good way to win these types of games. You can see Sulky realizes what's going on. I think he didn't get the Observer, so okay. He realizes that he has to run away now, and if you ever have these Swarm Hosts on the move, you absolutely can't relent. You just have to go, 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 and keep going until he's either dead or until you have a good reason to maybe recall with your Mothership Core, or at least pull back. So another wave of Locust is coming out here. He wants to deal with these as efficiently as possible. Maybe he could select his Zealots and pull them back so he doesn't lose them and let the Colossus burn down the Locust. But because he's had this composition, and because he hasn't been sitting back in his base for so long, he's able to take a big fight like this. And he might be able to just win this game right now. Fast forwarding here, a couple Viper pulls do really well against the Colossus. It doesn't look like he has quite enough to end the game right away, but at least reducing the Swarm Host count and reducing the support is really going to help out a lot. And it looks, I don't even know how he's possibly going to lose this game at this point, unless he just gets rallied on, or he has to recall or something. He doesn't have much support energy, so he's in really good shape right now, and all of a sudden this has kind of turned into a regular game. There's only, let's see, 5 Swarm Hosts on the map. That's barely enough to matter. So you can kind of consider that the Swarm Hosts are basically defeated until Sulky produces more. So from this point in the game, this is just like any other PvZ, and we've kind of passed the Swarm Host phase. He could add more here, but this is to the point where if you are adding more Swarm Hosts this late in the game after already losing a fight on your turf, then you're in pretty bad shape. So Sulky's probably not going to go back into Swarm Hosts from this point, and that'll hopefully at least give you guys a decent foundation as far as dealing with Swarm Hosts. So let's quit this replay and let's jump into the last one that I have here. This time we're going to be watching Alicia versus Revival. This is a pretty unusual way to deal with Swarm Hosts, but a really smart one that I really like and you don't see very often. So we're going to be, of course, watching Alicia considering they are the Protoss. By the way, Alicia is a guy's name. I think it's some character from an anime or something that he got his name from. So this isn't a girl playing. The only really pro-level girl that plays is Scarlet. She plays Zerg, so just in case anybody was wondering. So, coming down here, there's normal stuff from both players, expansion from both players, third from the Zerg, nothing unusual. Sentries, Zealots, Mothership Core coming out. Here comes the Twilight Council now. And this is a really early Twilight Council, and this isn't going to be for Blink this time. This is going to be actually for DTs. So, DTs can be a little bit of a risk against Zerg, but if you can hide this tech, maybe catch them not putting up spores, you can deal some damage. But that's not the overall purpose of this. DTs can have more than just the one point of going in there and trying to kill bases or kill drones or whatever. So you can see the DT tech on the way. And the idea here is that if you can ever get the Swarm Hosts by themselves, and if you can ever get a point where there's no detection over the Swarm Hosts, you can kill it with DTs and Observers. And that's a pretty cute way to do it that I haven't seen very often, but that I also really like. So here come the DT Warpins now. And this is kind of incidental to the game. It actually doesn't do too much damage because Revival actually does have spores. So like I said, this isn't the whole point of it. So the DTs are kind of pushed away and they shouldn't really do much. Behind this, he's going to take a third base. And Revival, actually smartly realizing that Alicia's Colossus tech is going to be pretty late, is just going to go for Swarm Hosts in response to the DTs. And we'll see that come up here in just a second. So we're just watching the production tab here. There's Burrow. You don't actually need Burrow to use Swarm Hosts, that's kind of annoying. But a lot of other options here so far. And this can also be a little bit later game Swarm Host play as well. It doesn't need to be right away. So we're actually going to see a Roach and Zergling attack before the Swarm Hosts start to build up. So the Infestation Pit's on the way. He might be trying to bait out things like Immortals against the Roaches, so that may be a little bit part of his strategy. But either way, he's just going to try and defend against this the best he can. There will be videos about defending this type of attack in particular, but I really want to focus on when the Swarm Hosts start to come out. So Force Fields, good micro, all that stuff, and he holds just fine. Now the Swarm Hosts are coming across the map, and this is when he needs to start thinking about ways to deal with that. So once you realize anyway that there are Swarm Hosts coming out, that's when you need to start a Warp Prism right away. Probably start your Colossus Bay so that you can get Colossus on the field to deal with them in long term. But the Warp Prism is going to be multifaceted. This is again one of those things where if they're out on the map and they have Swarm Hosts at your base, they're not going to have much back at home, and DTs are really good as far as ripping bases down when Zerg isn't protecting them. But secondarily, if you have second warp endpoints, we're going to see this a little bit later in the game. But let's say their Swarm Hosts are burrowed like right here, and you have a warp endpoint that's weird like right here, then you can maybe send in a flank from behind and get on top of these Swarm Hosts when they've sent their Locusts out and they can't protect themselves. So, a lot of cool ways to get on top of those. So, Colossus Bay is coming up now as we'd expect. Here's the Warp Prism on the way, because I think that Alicia knows what's going on with the Locusts, so Warp Prism's rallying out right now. You can see Roaches and stuff rallying forward. The Swarm Hosts are going to start to be more and more of a presence as the game goes on, though. And we're going to see that point when he uses the DTs and the detection there to wipe out the Swarm Hosts when there's no protection on them. So this is a really cool play, and it kind of perfectly demonstrates a good idea as far as handling these. So right now, he doesn't really have a good opportunity because there's too much protection right there. You can't really send that out. You could also try and snipe this Overseer with maybe a Void Ray or some Blink Stalkers or something if you wanted to be really cute and then get on top of the Swarm Hosts, but that's a little bit harder to do. So here's a little more of a weird warp endpoint. You can see the Warp Prism is heading out now. There is Roach Burrow on the way as well. But the DTs are starting to head out for a counterattack, and this is the whole point that all the Swarm Hosts and all the support are all forward, that means these bases are wide open to be harassed. So there's plenty of opportunity there, and we're going to watch a lot of this unfold. I'm going to slow this down so we can see everything going on at once. Overcharging the Nexus just needs to try to trade as effectively as possible with these locusts. But the DTs are starting to intercept reinforcements a little bit. He's actually being just a little bit sloppy. But here you go. They've kind of just trickled into this part of the army. And you'll notice that the roaches and the detection are all totally out of position. They're trying to deal damage right now. So they aren't out of position because of the harassment. They're more out of position because they're trying to be too aggressive. So either way, if they're out of position and you have detection in these DTs, you can just get right on top of the swarm host, maybe target them down one at a time. And the longer they stay here and the longer they try to fight here, then the better trades you're going to get because you're killing their swarm host. So these DTs are going to really start going to work, and Revival really doesn't have much of an answer. You can't just unburrow these, otherwise the DTs will still kill them. And you can't really send this back because then the army can just surround it from all sides and it'll burn down the swarm hosts anyway. So getting unusual angles on top of these swarm hosts is a really cool way to deal with them. And now that the swarm host count is reset, there's Colossus on the field and everything else. There's not a whole lot more that Revival can do as far as swarm hosts. He has to switch into something else here. Otherwise, the transition is going to be so slow that Alicia could just attack across the map and kill him. So if you ever do get a bunch of swarm host kills like this, it's a really good idea just to get out on the map and attack them right away, because if they're sleeping on the job, or if they're trying to get back into swarm host or something, you can probably catch them while the swarm hosts are building, or when the swarm hosts are kind of contained back at their base, and you can just avoid them. So a lot of really cool opportunity there, and at least I hope that gave you guys some decent ideas on how to deal with swarm hosts. It's obviously a lot easier said than done, but mostly you need to know the different ways you can get around them, different ways you can micro against them, different builds that'll put you in a good position. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I'll always be back for much more in the future, so look out for that. In the meantime, take care.